The last time anyone saw Mary and Joseph was on a Sunday afternoon after church service when they were going for their honeymoon in Montreal. Mary is a chorister, and Joseph is a well-known hiker, even though he was an asthmatic patient. They promised to spend 1 week, but when they didn't return after 1 week, it was assumed they were enjoying the honeymoon so much that they had to extend it. But when they didn't surface after 2 weeks, police were involved and they were declared missing. And after search parties went out in search for them in the hiking trail where Joseph and his wife last visited in Montreal. An inhaler was found in the quiet hiking trail, revealing a sinister truth hidden deep in the hiking trails. Mary and Joseph were the kind of couple people rarely noticed, not because they were unimportant, but because they lived softly. They spoke gently, kept to themselves, and moved through their neighborhood without drawing attention. In a place where gossip traveled fast, they gave nothing to talk about. They had just gotten married. Their love wasn't loud or performative. It was calm, steady, the kind that showed itself in small routines, early morning prayers, quiet dinners, and shared silences that didn't feel awkward. Joseph worked hard and minded his business. Mary sang in church every week, her voice familiar to the congregation even when her presence went unnoticed. Mary was a chorister deeply committed. Rehearsals mattered to her. Sundays mattered. Her faith shaped her rhythm, and those who paid attention knew she never missed church without a reason. Joseph, on the other hand, had one passion that defined him beyond anything else: hiking. If there was one thing neighbors knew about Joseph, it was that he loved the outdoors. He talked about trails the way some people talked about cities. Heights didn't scare him. Difficult terrain excited him. He had been hiking for years, long before he met Mary, and over time he had become extremely skilled. He planned routes carefully, studied maps, understood weather patterns, and respected nature's dangers. Joseph was a pro. But Joseph also carried a quiet vulnerability. He was asthmatic. He had lived with it for most of his life and managed it carefully. He never went anywhere without his inhaler. He understood his limits and planned his hikes with his condition in mind. Experience had taught him discipline. Mary trusted Joseph completely, especially when it came to hiking. She admired how confident he was on trails, how calm he remained even in difficult terrain. Hiking to Joseph wasn't reckless, it was calculated, controlled, safe. So when they decided to go hiking in Montreal for their honeymoon, no one questioned it. To them, it made sense. They didn't want crowded beaches or noisy hotels. They wanted quiet, nature, time alone, a place where they could breathe, talk, and simply exist together as husband and wife. Before leaving, Mary informed her choir master that she wouldn't be around for a week. It was said casually, without drama. A honeymoon, nothing unusual. The church wished her well. Their apartment was locked. Their bags were packed neatly. Joseph double-checked his gear. Mary carried only what she needed. They left behind no signs of urgency, no hints of fear, no unfinished business. Just a married couple going on a honeymoon hike. They arrived in Montreal and headed toward the hiking trails Joseph had researched extensively. The environment was calm, beautiful, and deceptively peaceful. Tall trees, narrow paths, elevated trails that overlooked deep, quiet drops. The kind of place that felt untouched and unforgiving. They started their hike like countless others had before them. Footsteps on gravel, light conversation, laughter that faded into the trees. Joseph led the way, confident and relaxed. Mary followed, trusting him, enjoying the moment, unaware that this path would become the final one she ever walked. There were no witnesses who noticed anything strange. No hikers who raised alarms. No screams reported. No calls for help. Just silence. And somewhere along that trail, far from the safety of the main paths, Mary and Joseph vanished. No one would realize it that day, or the next, or even the week after. Because when two quiet people disappear quietly, the world doesn't stop to notice. And that honeymoon hike, meant to mark the beginning of their life together, would instead become the last time anyone ever saw Mary and Joseph alive. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and also share with your loved ones. The first few days after Mary and Joseph left passed exactly as expected. The world continued without them, unaware that two lives had already slipped out of its rhythm. Their apartment remained locked. The curtains stayed drawn the same way. No lights turned on at night, but no one questioned it. Newlyweds were allowed to disappear for a while. Joseph had mentioned the trip casually to 3 of his hiking trainees before leaving. He told them he would be gone for a week, maybe slightly more, but that he would be back by the second week to resume their sessions. It sounded ordinary, planned, responsible. There was nothing in his voice that suggested uncertainty or risk. To them, this was just Joseph being Joseph, experienced, prepared, and confident. So when the first week passed and no one heard from him, no one panicked. Honeymoons stretch, plans change, trails don't always have reception. Silence in this case felt normal. At the church, the atmosphere was just as calm. Mary's absence during the first rehearsal didn't raise any concern. Everyone knew she had requested time off. Her seat in the choir stood empty, but empty seats weren't unusual. The choir master simply nodded and moved on. Mary was responsible. She would return when she said she would. But time has a way of making silence louder. The second rehearsal came and went. Mary still wasn't there. The choir master noticed this time, not in panic but in quiet awareness. Mary had never been careless with her commitments. If she was delayed, she would usually send word ahead. Still, the explanation felt easy. Maybe they decided to extend the honeymoon. Maybe travel plans shifted. The choir master pushed the thought aside. Meanwhile, Joseph's trainees began to exchange glances among themselves. The second week had arrived, and Joseph hadn't shown up. No messages, no updates. They told themselves the same thing everyone else did. He was probably enjoying his honeymoon. Experienced hikers deserved rest too. Days continued to pass. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It grew slowly, spreading through ordinary routines, hiding behind reasonable excuses. Every unanswered expectation was brushed aside by logic. Every concern was delayed by patience. But by the end of the second week, the absence could no longer be ignored. At church, the choir master felt a knot settle in his chest. Mary had now missed multiple rehearsals without notice. This was no longer like her. The empty seat had become a presence of its own. Other choir members began whispering questions, soft enough not to interrupt practice but loud enough to carry worry. "Have you heard from Mary?" The answer was always the same. "No." The unease spread quietly, just like the silence before it. Not sharp enough to cause alarm yet, but heavy enough to be felt. Something was wrong, but no one could yet say what. Because the truth was simple and terrifying. No one noticed Mary and Joseph were missing. Because no one was looking. And somewhere far from the church, far from their locked apartment, and far from anyone who knew them, two lives lay completely alone, waiting to be discovered, while the world moved on as if nothing had happened at all. By the time the choir master decided to act, the silence had become impossible to ignore. The following day, the choir master arrived with 2 members of the choir. Their steps were slower, more cautious. This wasn't curiosity, it was concern. They knocked, waited, knocked again. Silence answered them each time. The door remained firmly locked. One of the choir members pressed her face close to the window. The curtains were still drawn in the same position. No lights, no signs of life. It looked frozen in time. They tried Mary's number, straight to no connection. They tried Joseph's, the same. Standing there, something finally shifted. This wasn't a couple enjoying privacy. This wasn't a delayed return. This was absence, complete and unexplained. The choir master felt it settle deep in his chest, a quiet realization that something was wrong in a way that couldn't be brushed aside anymore. Unbeknownst to the church, Joseph's hiking students had already been there a day earlier. They had come expecting a simple explanation. Maybe Joseph had extended his honeymoon. Maybe he forgot to inform them. They stood in front of the apartment building, knocking lightly at first, then louder. No answer. The door was locked. The curtains inside hadn't moved. The place looked untouched, as if no one had been home for days. They called Joseph's phone. It didn't connect. Assuming travel delays, they left, but with unease they couldn't quite shake. And for the first time since the honeymoon began, fear stepped into the space where patience used to be. The unease followed them back to church. The choir master and the two choristers didn't sit through the service the same way that day. Their minds were elsewhere, replaying the locked door, the unmoved curtains, and the phones that refused to connect. When the service ended, they went straight to the pastor and explained everything: Mary's absence, the unanswered calls, the visit to her home, and the growing fear that something was deeply wrong. The pastor listened carefully. Mary wasn't just another member of the church, she was one of their own, responsible, devoted, predictable in the best way. Her disappearance didn't align with her character. The pastor didn't hesitate. He contacted the police that same day. Within hours, Mary and Joseph were officially listed as missing persons. The police began by reconstructing the last known movements of the couple. Their apartment showed no signs of struggle. Their belongings were untouched. Neighbors had seen nothing unusual. Eventually, all leads pointed in one direction: the honeymoon hike in Montreal. Their last known location was deep inside a forest. Local authorities coordinated with park rangers, and search efforts began immediately. Officers and trained search teams combed through the popular hiking trails first, the places most visitors used, the paths marked clearly on maps. If the couple had gotten lost, injured, or delayed, this was where they were most likely to be found. But the forest offered nothing. No abandoned bags. No torn clothing. No footprints that led anywhere meaningful. No signs of panic or struggle. As the search expanded, conditions worsened. The weather shifted unexpectedly, fog rolled in, rain softened the ground, and visibility dropped. The terrain itself became an obstacle. Steep trails, unstable rocks, and deep drops slowed progress and limited where teams could safely go. Each passing hour made the task harder. The forest, vast and indifferent, gave nothing back. By the end of the initial search phase, investigators were left with a disturbing reality. Two people had vanished in a place filled with trails, yet left behind no trace of their existence. And for the first time since the report was filed, a question no one wanted to ask began to surface. What if they weren't going to be found where everyone was looking? As days stretched on with no answers, the silence around Mary and Joseph was replaced by noise, questions, theories, and uneasy speculation. The public wanted explanations, and when none came, people began filling the gaps themselves. Some believed the couple had simply gotten lost. Forests were unpredictable, they said. Even experienced hikers made mistakes. Others whispered about foul play, wondering if something more sinister had occurred far from the safety of marked trails. And then there were those who suggested something colder, that Mary and Joseph may have chosen to disappear, leaving their old lives behind without warning. To those who knew them, that theory felt wrong. Mary was too devoted, Joseph too responsible, but doubt doesn't need evidence to spread, it only needs time. Within the search teams, frustration grew quietly. The popular trails had been searched repeatedly. Every reasonable location had turned up nothing. It was during one of these tense briefings that a seasoned park ranger spoke up. there was one area they hadn't searched. It was a trail few hikers used, and for good reason. Narrow paths clung to steep elevations. The ground was unstable in places, loose with gravel and sudden drops that disappeared into deep, unforgiving spaces below. Rangers often warned visitors away from it. Accidents there were rarely survivable. The suggestion was met with hesitation. Sending teams into that area meant real danger. One wrong step could create more victims instead of answers. For a moment, the room fell silent as the weight of the decision settled in. Finally, reluctant approval was given. The team moved carefully, every step deliberate. The higher they climbed, the more hostile the terrain became. Wind cut sharply through the trees. Rocks shifted beneath their boots. At several points, the risk felt overwhelming. They paused more than once, considered turning back, questioned whether this place was worth it. But something about the silence there felt different. If Mary and Joseph weren't on the safe trails, then this was the only place left. And as the team pressed forward into the most dangerous part of the forest, none of them knew they were only moments away from the first truth: the wilderness had been hiding all along. The search team moved slowly through the dangerous trail, scanning the ground as carefully as they watched their footing. Every step felt deliberate, heavy with tension. The forest was unusually still, as though it were holding its breath. Then someone stopped. Partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and damp soil was a small object that didn't belong there. It wasn't natural. It didn't blend in. It stood out precisely because it was ordinary. An inhaler. The team didn't need to be told what it meant. From the very beginning of the investigation, they had known Joseph was asthmatic. His condition had been mentioned repeatedly in reports, almost as a footnote, until now. This was no longer a theory. This was confirmation. Joseph and Mary had been here. The inhaler rested quietly in a place no casual hiker would ever wander into. It hadn't been placed carefully. It looked dropped, lost in urgency rather than discarded. For a moment, no one spoke. The object carried too much weight for casual words. If Joseph had been calm, he would have kept it with him. If everything had gone according to plan, it wouldn't be on the ground. Which meant something had gone wrong. The team searched the surrounding area with renewed intensity. Eyes followed the slope of the terrain, tracing where a foot might slip, where someone might stumble or fall. The ground dipped sharply nearby, disappearing into a drop too steep to see the bottom from where they stood. A question hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. If the inhaler was here, where was Joseph? The forest, once again, offered no immediate answer. But the inhaler had broken the silence. It was subtle at first, something barely noticeable beneath the scent of damp earth and pine. One of the rangers slowed his pace, then stopped completely. He turned slightly, testing the air again, his expression tightening. Others noticed it seconds later. A smell that didn't belong. It was faint, but unmistakable to those who had worked search operations before. The quiet confidence the team had carried moments earlier vanished. No one needed to say it out loud. Decomposition had a presence of its own, and it announced itself long before anything could be seen. The forest suddenly felt closer, heavier. They followed the direction of the scent carefully, stepping off the narrow trail and toward a steep, uneven slope. Every movement was deliberate now. Radios were lowered. Voices dropped. The ground dipped sharply ahead, obscured by brush and shadows that swallowed the light. Then someone saw it. A shape that wasn't rock, wasn't wood, wasn't part of the forest. As they moved closer, the reality came into focus. Two bodies lying unnaturally still, partially hidden by time and terrain. Clothing torn, skin darkened by decay. Nature had already begun reclaiming them. The shock landed in waves. One body lay motionless beside the other, close enough to suggest an attempt to help, or to stay. And then they saw the skull. It was badly damaged, cracked, broken in a way that spoke of violent impact rather than time alone. Even without words, the scene told a story of sudden tragedy. No one moved for a long moment. Training took over eventually. The area was secured, procedures followed, but nothing prepared them for the weight of what they had found. Because finding bodies was one thing. Understanding how they died, and why they were never found sooner, was something far worse. Once the bodies were recovered, the forest released its hold on the mystery and handed it over to science. The remains were transported carefully, respectfully, as the weight of what had been found settled over everyone involved in the search. The first confirmation came through DNA analysis. There was no longer any uncertainty. The identities matched. The two bodies found deep within the dangerous trail belonged to Mary and Joseph. The news moved quickly, and with it came a quiet devastation. Hope, however fragile, disappeared completely. Then came the autopsies. Mary's injuries told a clear and brutal story. Severe trauma to the skull indicated a violent impact, consistent with a fall from a significant height. The fractures were extensive, leaving no doubt that the fall had been fatal. Investigators concluded that she likely slipped or lost her footing on the unstable trail and fell hard, with no chance to recover. Joseph's findings were different and far more painful. There were no signs of blunt force trauma severe enough to explain his death, no defensive wounds, no injuries suggesting another fall. Instead, the evidence pointed inward. His lungs showed signs consistent with a fatal asthma attack. The conclusion was unavoidable. Joseph had survived Mary's fall. The realization struck with devastating clarity. He had been alive after the accident, long enough to reach her, long enough to try, long enough to fight his own body while facing the unthinkable. Without his inhaler and likely overwhelmed by shock, panic, and physical exertion, his condition turned deadly. Alone, deep in the forest with no help coming, Joseph lost the battle he had managed his entire life. The twist wasn't a crime. There was no villain to arrest. Just a sequence of cruel moments, each compounding the next. Mary died instantly. Joseph died trying to save her. And in the end, nature had delivered its verdict, silent, impartial, and final. There was no arrest to make, no suspect to parade in handcuffs, no courtroom where a verdict would be read aloud. The investigation closed with a truth that was both simple and devastating. No crime had been committed. But justice was still served. The full findings were made public, and with them came uncomfortable questions about safety and prevention. The trail where Mary and Joseph were found had long been considered dangerous, yet warnings had been minimal. In the wake of their deaths, park authorities conducted a thorough review of safety policies. What had once been overlooked was now impossible to ignore. Clear warning signs were installed at the entrances to high-risk trails. Emergency location markers were added, giving hikers a way to communicate their position if disaster struck. Rangers increased patrols in previously avoided areas. These changes came too late for Mary and Joseph, but not for those who would come after them. Their tragedy became a lesson written into the landscape itself. Back in the city, the church gathered in quiet grief. The memorial service was filled beyond capacity, not with noise but with shared silence. When the choir stood to sing, one seat remained empty. It was left that way intentionally. Mary's absence was acknowledged, honored, and felt. Her voice was gone, but not forgotten. Montreal mourned them together. A couple who lived quietly had left a loud impact. Their story reminded the city that love doesn't need attention to matter, and that loss doesn't need violence to be unjust. In the end, Mary and Joseph didn't vanish. They changed things. And in doing so, they made sure that their final journey would not be meaningless.